FreedomWorks. And it's like, well, probably one of the biggest and best grassroots organizations in the country. In 2012, when Ted Cruz got elected, I went down to Dallas at a FreedomWorks rally, probably the biggest rally of the 2012 election season. But really, more importantly, the reason I'm here is because I've heard FreedomWorks has the best happy hour.
This is true. We're proud of that.
But this has been a busy week for us here. We had a historic meeting in the old Senate chambers this week, all 100 senators all coming together to have a conversation. And I've been asking for this for over a year. I've been saying to Senator Reid, why don't we come together and talk about some of these issues and maybe we'll find some common ground. We tend to go to Republican caucus lunch, Democrat caucus lunch, and we tend not to talk. So we came together, and the issue really was the filibuster. Most of the Democrats don't seem to care too much about the filibuster. They just want their nominees to go through. And so statistics were presented on both sides, but the Republicans basically said, look, nominees have been going through about as well as they went through for George Bush. There's not really statistically a lot of difference. Democrats, some of which just really don't care too much about the filibuster. They don't mind if it becomes majority rule. But our founding fathers thought it was better to slow things down in the Senate. There supposedly is a conversation between Jefferson and Washington where Washington says to Jefferson that the Senate will be like with a hot cup of tea that spills over into the saucer, and it will slow down to cool the tempest of the House of Representatives. And there is some truth to that. We have different procedures. The filibuster is a delaying tactic. It is an obstruction. But I think it's really important. I mean, right now I'm using the filibuster to say that the FBI director, I'm trying to stop, basically. Not because I dislike him in particular, but because the FBI has now said they're using drones. They're using drones to do surveillance of American citizens, and I have some questions. Are they asking a judge for a warrant? Are they flying over people's backyard? Are they using probable cause? How many drones do they have? Are they planning on arming the drones? I mean, these are some pretty important questions that you would think the American people deserve to know, but I asked them 3 or 4 weeks ago and I've gotten no answer. So the leverage I use is I threaten to filibuster or place a hold on the FBI director, hoping that that leverage will get some more information. We do this all the time, and I think it's a very useful tool. So I've argued strenuously that the filibuster is a good idea, that it helps the Republic. And also you have to think about, are we drifting towards the Constitution or away from the Constitution? We've been drifting away from it for a long time, so you would hope that it would be a slow drift and that by slowing things down in the Senate, it's a good idea. So that's basically what's been going on this week. There have been some fights. We won in a way. The courts have now ruled that the recess appointments of the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, were basically unconstitutional. That the Senate, when we say we're in session, and that the White House can't unilaterally say, hey guys, you're not in session, and we're going to go ahead and just appoint people through recess. And the court cases have actually been a pretty dramatic case, and we're hoping it goes to the Supreme Court. So we fought against seating these new nominees that we think were illegally and unconstitutionally nominated by the president. And the Democrats did pull back on it. They pulled back and they said, we're not going to put forward the two that were illegally put forward by the president. And that's sort of where we are at this point. And we'll be waiting on the court case. But I think when it's a very important constitutional question, the filibuster is an important thing to have. And so this is kind of where we are. What I'd like to do now, though, maybe is hear from some of your grassroots folks and see if they have any questions.
Sure, that would be great. Our first question is from Sarah, who says, Elizabeth Cheney has announced her intention to challenge Mike Enzi. Is there any danger that the Republican Party will start to move away from conservative principles?
Well, my first response when I heard that Liz Cheney was running was I said, oh, well, that's great. Is she going to run in her home state of Virginia? But no. Many
of us might have guessed.
Because apparently she was rumored that she was going to run last year for the U.S. Senate in Virginia, where I guess she's lived most of her life. But I think she's moved back to Wyoming to do this. But no, I'll be supporting Senator Enzi, and I think that there is a faction of our party that I think is too aggressive in their approach to feeling like we have to be involved in every war around the world.
Right.
And I think that war is a terrible thing and should be approached reluctantly. It's not that we don't go to war and that we shouldn't defend our country, but I think we should be reluctant. And I think there are some people within the party who may show an overeagerness or a rashness to war. And I think Senator Enzi showed a much more reasoned approach.
You know, it's interesting, actually, from questions of national security that go overseas to questions of national security at home. We've heard so much in recent years, or in recent months, rather, that the administration kind of feels that it has found the right balance in terms of national security programs. And these concerns sort of metastasized at the same time as the administration was being hit with scandals about perhaps over-intrusion into the Associated Press, obviously the IRS inquisition of conservative and Tea Party groups. One of the questions we have this evening from a friend of ours on Facebook, this is David, he asks, George Bush left office with a 22% approval rating. We've got all these scandals affecting President Obama. Why has it not scratched him in the same way that it perhaps hurt President Bush?
You know, I'm not sure it's not. I'm not sure exactly what the president's current numbers are, but I know in the last month he's lost 20 points with the young people. And I think hypocrisy isn't tolerated by the American youth. I mean, he said he was going to defend the internet. He said he was going to defend our privacy. He said that he was going to defend civil liberties, and it appears that he's been hypocritical on this. You know, he sent his national intelligence director to Congress, who basically lied to us and said they weren't collecting any American data or any data on American phone calls. And apparently they were not only collecting some data, they were collecting all the data on every cell phone transaction, every cell phone call. And I think that's disappointed a lot of young people.
That's for sure. And actually bringing up young people, I think that's an important issue, particularly for us here at FreedomWorks, where we have a young staff and we've done our best to kind of reach out to some of those let's call them millennials that are out there and they're interested in the ideas of liberty and freedom. How are we seeing these civil liberties issues kind of mature into issues that young people can find themselves on the right side of the issue about? And is that an experience perhaps that you obviously witnessed with your father's popularity and now perhaps something that you're staking claim to as well too?
Well, you know, the president's fond of saying he's striking this balance, you know, between liberty and security, but really doesn't appear. I mean, his words are good. I mean, he often says the right things, and you hear him, and I tell people, frankly, I want to clap when I hear him talk about civil liberties because he sounds so good. But his policy doesn't mirror what he says. He frankly says and talks a great game on civil liberties, but then his policy is the opposite. I would say that he has much less regard for civil liberties than the Republican administration had. Liberals and progressives across our country went crazy over George Bush and attacked him on issues of war and civil liberties. But it turns out they're all, not all, but mostly quiet now as the president appears to be much more authoritarian, this current president, and much more invasive of privacy. And just think about it. You know, the Fourth Amendment says you need to name the person, the place, and the papers. It's individualized. He thinks through one warrant he can collect all the records of all the people in the United States, or all the people with Verizon, all the people with AT&T, millions of people through one warrant. That so goes against the grain of our Fourth Amendment. But even the people who aren't maybe avid or fervent defenders of the Fourth Amendment, the people who supported the Patriot Act, one of the authors of the Patriot Act said that what he's doing goes against what even the people who supported the Patriot Act thought it would be used for. And Senator Wyden has been very good on this. Senator Wyden has said repeatedly that they need to be honest with what they're doing. Because, see, here's what they would report to us. They would say, oh, we only issued 20 warrants last year. It's no big deal. 20 people, or they don't say this, 20 warrants, 300 million people. We're really not applying to many people. But they didn't tell us that each warrant was for 1 billion phone records.
Or federal agent letters that also allowed them intrusion.
And there's
somewhere between kind of Common Core, gun registry, the AP scandal, the NSA overreach, drones, the increased census data. There has to be this kind of critical mass that must be building right now. And are you experiencing that? Are you kind of hearing that at the moment from people that this is too much and it's more than we can swallow at this point?
I've sort of said what we have is sort of the old McDonald's farm of scandals. Here a scandal, there a scandal, everywhere a scandal. And it's where to begin. But I think the compilation of all of these scandals, what you're finding is, I really do think he's losing the moral authority to lead the nation. Now, what does that mean? Doesn't mean he's no longer legally president, but I think he's losing the moral authority in the sense that you need a consensus of the people. People have to believe that you have the best interest of the country involved. And particularly the IRS scandal. When you look at the IRS scandal and people think, well, gosh, I worked in the last election. I worked for Republicans. Does that mean I'm going to be targeted? Or I was part of the Tea Party, or I belong to FreedomWorks. Does that mean I'm going to be targeted for that? Or let's say I'm an evangelical Christian and I want the government to stay out of my church. Does that mean I'm going to be targeted? I don't think anybody wants that. Even if you're a Democrat, I don't think Democrats want, if the Republicans win, that they're going to use the government to go after their enemies. So I think it really has damaged his credibility.
Yeah, and that's the problem too. I mean, big government, when you give that much power to a single entity, it's going to corrupt, regardless of who's in power. And when you have that much discretionary power, where you get to pick and choose that selective enforcement of who gets punished for whatever reason, it's a very dangerous thing, and it's interesting. I think you're right. I really like that point about losing the moral authority.
Sure.
Because when you can't trust, I mean, you have everybody saying, well, this is for your own good. Government, it's with the best of intentions, but people don't think years down the road that character, that person that you believe in, that's at the top of leadership is not going to be there anymore.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. It's the power more than even the person. Because if the president were sitting here, he would tell you he's a good person. And I actually take him at his word. You know, for example, we had this big debate over whether he would use a drone to kill someone in a cafe. That was what my filibuster was about.
I recall that.
But, you know, it really wasn't so much that I believed he would actually do it. But I don't think it's enough for someone to say, oh, I'm a good person. It is about, do you have the authority and do you claim the authority? Because, for example, with indefinite detention, the law of the land that President Obama signed says that an American citizen can be detained forever, sent to Guantanamo Bay without charge, without trial, and without a lawyer. I think most Americans would be horrified if they actually knew this. But the president says, oh, I don't plan to use it. Well, that's not the way we really run government. You know, Madison said if government were comprised of angels, we wouldn't have to worry about restraint. But you really do need that restraint because maybe President Obama is a good person. What about the next president, now that we have the authority? What about what happened to the Japanese? What about happened to African Americans in 1910 and 1900 who were detained, accused, and often found guilty of crimes they had nothing to do with simply because of the color of their skin?
Yeah, it seems that the kind of big government agenda puts far too much dependence on nameless, faceless bureaucrats who we depend on to be benevolent. We simply can't at this point in time. I think that may lead us to another question. This is coming from James, I believe from Facebook. So in polls on NSA snooping, Americans seem divided on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Have we become complacent?
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, some people say the outrage is greater right now in Europe over privacy and snooping on the internet than it is here. However, I would say that young people often lead the charge on this. And if you were to separate out and poll young people on the NSA and on spying and on whether or not your internet records and your phone records and your visa records are private and should be protected from government snooping unless there's a warrant, I think you'd find that young people would overwhelmingly say, yes, there is an expectation of privacy.
Absolutely. And also I wanted to touch really quickly, while we're talking about young people, it's so important for our society to have a constituency of informed Americans. And we see there are federal takeovers, but there's also not an assault on education, but we're not providing enough choices for kids to get a quality education. I know you guys are doing a school choice event on July 30th, I believe. Do you want to talk a little bit to that? Why is this such a priority?
Well, I think that competition breeds excellence. And so when kids have a choice as to which school to go to, the good schools will survive and the bad schools won't. And I think really that our public school system, it has some bright spots. I went to public school. I was able to take calculus and physics and biology 2 and chemistry 2 in public high school. But a lot of kids didn't get the kind of public high school I went to. And in the middle of DC, we're spending 20 grand per pupil. The class sizes have gotten smaller, but the grades are still miserable, and there's drug problems and discipline problems. And for the kid who wants to really excel, there's not a good way out. And so I'm all for vouchers and school choice. Let the kid go to a better public school or a private school or a religious school or a charter school, but let them have a choice and make the schools compete for students. Even the federal money, well, I'm really not for a federal involvement in education. As long as they are involved, let's attach the federal money also to the students and let the students take it where they want to go to school.
Now, you mentioned literally in the middle of D.C., and that brings us to our next question from Sam. What is your reception at outreach events like Howard University, obviously in the middle of D.C., been, and how can the Republican Party do a better job of reaching out to minorities?
You know, I think the school choice is a great issue because I think a lot of kids in the city have been shortchanged by our educational system. I think there's some libertarian ideas also. For example, the ACLU recently put out statistics saying that blacks are incarcerated at 4 or 5 times the rates as whites for the same crimes. And really, with a much smaller population of African Americans, it's hard to imagine that drug use is so high that they deserve to be incarcerated at 4 to 5 times the rate. So I think for libertarians who believe in less harsh sentencing, more fair adjudication of things like nonviolent crimes, I think that's something that will appeal. I also think that people deserve a second chance. I think if you've been convicted of a crime when you're younger and you've gone through a period of time when you haven't, when you've been a law-abiding citizen, that you ought to be welcomed back and allowed to get some of the privileges back of being a citizen.
Absolutely. Our next question from Mike. What surprised you most about the Senate as an institution?
You know, probably that you could jump in running from the very first day. Seriously, that people think, I was a physician in a small town, and when I ran against a politician who'd been elected to several different offices, they're like, oh, you can't run for the U.S. Senate because you've never been elected to anything. I sort of see that as actually an asset, not having been elected to anything, because I think politics beats you down after a while. And the fact that I hadn't been elected to anything, that I'd been running a small business, a physician in a small town, helped me actually not to be too jaded by the political system. But I think my surprise was that I could immediately hit the ground running from the first day. And I think if you really want to make a difference, I think I've been involved in every debate up here. I get amendments, and I think even the other side, has a little bit of respect for that. The Democrats come up to me and mention publicly that they appreciate what I did with the filibuster, and actually some of them came and supported it.
Right. Now, it's funny because we think of the Senate, I think sometimes in those terms that we romanticize either in headlines or in Hollywood. But you mentioned kind of this bipartisan element as well, too, and kind of moving a little bit back to this collection of the collection of information that perhaps is too broad and intrusive, in contrast to perhaps a bipartisan divide on an issue like the filibuster. How have you felt about the kind of bipartisan camaraderie that you felt regarding federal overreach, whether it's from the administration or federal agencies that are subordinate?
I think that there is, and some people think that bipartisanship means that you and I disagree and we sort of meet in the middle all the time. To me, the way I see bipartisanship is that I strongly believe in these issues. I'm not even saying I'm cutting my issues in half to come halfway, but I'm finding people on the other side of the aisle who believe just as passionately. Right. Ron Wyden and I have worked together on a lot of civil liberties issues. I've also worked with Merkley and others on issues of trying to end the war in Afghanistan. I think our mission's done and we need to come home, the sooner the better. I've tried to prevent us from going to war in Syria. I frankly think it's a mistake to be supplying arms and money to Islamic rebels who in all likelihood will be killing Christians on the other side of this war, who in all likelihood, or who actually are allied with Al-Qaeda, fighting against the other side. So there are definitely issues that we've worked together on the idea of mandatory minimums. You can have a 2 teenage kids go out and one overdoses on drugs and dies, which is very sad, but the one who lives can get 20 years mandatory minimum in jail for supplying the drugs because a death occurred. Well, the death is tragic. I think it's unfair to have mandatory minimums where the judge has no discretion. Is it the kid's first crime? Was it an accidental death? Was it an overdose? Just having the death involved mandates that it's a 20-year sentence if it's in federal court. And so I worked with the Congressional Black Caucus to try to change this because I think our laws have disproportionately targeted black youths. And so there's a lot of, I think, overlap on some of these issues. Just this week on sexual harassment in the military, I came out and supported with a liberal Democratic senator the idea that, well, maybe women are not reporting these crimes because they're afraid of reporting it to their boss. And to me, the first time I heard it, it sort of made sense. Maybe you shouldn't have to report sexual harassment or sexual assault to your boss. You should have reported to an independent lawyer in the military, and it just made sense to me.
It's remarkable. It seems that more and more civil liberties are uniting Republicans, Democrats, young people, perhaps minorities as well, too. This sounds like really fertile soil moving forward.
And I think as if we consider myself to be a Republican Party trying to grow bigger, you want to get young people, and they're unsure which party they're going to join, and you say, oh, we're for low taxes and less regulation. Like, I don't have any money and I don't get regulated. I'm on the internet, regulate my internet less, protect my privacy, don't treat me unfairly in the criminal justice system. Those are ways that actually the Republican Party, I think, could grow.
Well, and Reed and I were talking about this earlier because our membership is always looking for ways to stay engaged and not only talk about problems, but make a difference in helping to find a solution. Is there anything you would recommend to our grassroots activists that they can be doing practically to make sure that these civil liberties abuses can never happen again?
I think congressmen do read emails, and so do their senators, and they add up. And so if you'll email, and then if you're really passionate about a particular issue coming up, jam their phone lines, call them up. It makes a difference. There's always some in the middle where there is some influence by phone calls and emails.
And I guess moving back to practical matters here, and a question from Steve, also from Facebook. This is going to be our last question of the evening as well, too. Well, Senator Paul, you've sent a couple letters recently on domestic drone surveillance. I think Steve would like to know if you've heard anything back from Eric Holder or Director Mueller.
Not yet. There are rumblings.
Should we hold our breath? Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's why I'm holding the FBI director, is wanting to know these questions. And in particular, I really want to know, and there's going to end up being the same way there's going to be, I think, some Supreme Court decisions ultimately about the NSA spying, because I don't think that a secret court can make an ultimate decision for our society. I think there's also going to be decisions on what they call the open spaces doctrine, that you can do surveillance of someone's property because it's not inside their house. I think you have an expectation of privacy outside your house, too. What the limits of that are, I think the court needs to decide. But if you've got a drone that flies at 50,000 feet and can tell whether you're drinking a beer in your backyard or what you're reading in your backyard, that to me is an invasion of privacy. Now, some people misconstrue that and they say, oh, you don't want to get criminals. No, if you're one of the Sonar F boys and they go to a judge and get probable cause, it's not hard to get a warrant. But it's one step that separates police from the judge. You get a warrant, I'm fine with surveillance. But I don't want them crisscrossing the skies and just looking in everybody's backyard, and I think that's a real problem with civil liberties, and I will continue to fight against it.
Yeah, it makes it tough to enjoy your barbecue.
Yeah, definitely. Especially, I remember there was a great piece written by, I think it was Tim Carney, in the Examiner, talking about how there are so many laws at this point that almost everyone is arguably a criminal in one way or another. So when you're talking about that larger issue of discretionary power, and you can go and target an American, which is not outside the realm of possibility, and find some little loophole in this incredibly complicated system of laws and regulations that we have that they might be breaking, combined with a surveillance state, you have a real problem.
Yeah, and they used to always say ignorance of the law is no excuse. But what if the laws run 20,000 pages for one bill? Obamacare has 20,000 pages of regulations. How could I possibly know I'm breaking the law? I'm still unclear what some of the ramifications will be. I mean, so some of these regulatory crimes that we put people in jail for, wetlands violations, all of these crazy things they're putting people in jail for, who could possibly know the Federal Register and know whether you're afoul of the law or not?
It's funny, we were laughing today in the office here about a magician who had a
I saw the
rabbit
story.
and who was suddenly contacted by the USDA, and then who was all of a sudden concern of FEMA regarding a disaster plan to evacuate this rabbit should anything go wrong. I don't know if you heard about this.
For his single rabbit, they're requesting that he have a disaster plan for what to do with it. So he hired somebody who's written a 28-page disaster plan for how to evacuate the rabbit.
Sounds reasonable.
Right. and the reporter gave away the magic secret in the story, too.
Yeah, that
I was so bummed.
That was disappointing.
That's the real tragedy here. Well, and I think we're running out of time here, so we have to close it out. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, Senator. And thanks everyone who is watching on the live stream, and thank you for submitting questions. You're watching FreedomWorks on Tap, and we will see you again next week.